So I'll stop recording now. Thank you. Thank you very much, and a warm welcome to everybody. This is the AEA Europe e-assessment special interest group, and it's one of our webinars which we began several years ago, and I think we had 2 webinars in the first year, and we're doing storming business for webinars now. So I'm very pleased to say that, yeah, this group is very popular. And we love having these webinars on all sorts of topics. So I am delighted today to introduce Dr. Rose Clesham, who is from Pearson, and who will be talking obviously about the title of her slide, about trust standards in technology. And obviously extremely prescient topic at the moment, given that we don't quite know where we're heading with assessment, particularly in England. But I'm sure the same is true in other parts of the world too. So we look forward to, Rose is going to talk, and then at the end of her talk, we'll have some time for Q&A. So you can ask out loud, but what's most helpful is if you type questions in the chat. I'll read them out at the end. And if we run out of time, which we often do, I will make sure that we collate the answers and we send them out to everybody as well in terms of, you know, other responses to you. So just to say, please keep your cameras turned off, and I think I have muted you all, but please do keep your sound off as well whilst the speaker is speaking. And once again, very warm welcome here to this UCL platform, and I will hand over now to Rose Clesham. Thank you very much, Rose.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Thank you for everybody for attending today. As Mary said, I'll probably talk for about 45 minutes. Sometimes get carried away, so let's see how that goes. And then we'll have some time at the end for any comments or questions or clarifications. The one thing I suppose as a caveat I would say is that I think I probably am, what I'm going to be talking today about is probably coming from a UK perspective more so than maybe, you know, an in-country European perspective. But that's only really partly because it's my experience, but I'll talk about that in a bit. But it's partly because as Mary said, the situation we have here to do with the use of the assessment in high stakes exams is not maybe the same as it is elsewhere, and that might be something that again we can discuss at the end. And the final thing I'll just say is that this is a, you know, these are sort of Pearson sort of branded slides, and my background is a Pearson background. This is a personal view, but I'm using exemplars from sort of assessments and products that I know about. But that would be my caveat to this. So, trust standards in technology, changing the face of educational assessment. Okay, so the first thing what I'm going to try to do is to try and sort of talk about it really with these 3 things being kept in the back of our minds all the time. In terms of trust, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about trust in teachers or trust in examinations? When we're talking about standards, what sort of standards are we talking about? And we know that we always have issues with perceptions of higher or lower standards, and what measures do we actually use here? And I suppose, obviously, the fact that it's in this special interest group, in particular, I'm going to draw it back into the notions of technology and how technology could and should be perhaps more than it is now. I hope you like my picture there. I've used that for the last 20 years, talking about these topics in terms of, is there light at the end of the tunnel? Or as my children might have said when they were sitting in the back of the car, whenever we went anywhere, are we nearly there yet? So this will maybe address some issues here. I'm not going to solve any problems, but I think I may raise some issues. So I think to give you a little bit of context here, once upon a time, a long time ago, I actually started teaching, and maybe I'll put that into context. So it wasn't like pre-war, but we're talking here about sort of mid-80s, okay? And at that time in this country, and again, this may have resonance depending on where you're sort of meeting us from today. At that time, there wasn't really any sort of set curriculum at all. It was sort of cafeteria style. It was sort of a bit of this and a bit of that. There was no national curriculum. I was actually a science teacher, and in the area that I taught in, even the subjects of science that were taught in the local schools were not the same. So some decided not to teach physics to the girls, and some, you know, there was just a real pick and mix. There was only formal examinations at 16 and 18, which is still maybe more than there are in some countries today. There were periods of trial and innovation, quite interesting things actually, which I'll mention in a second. And so in some ways, when I look back at it, they were like the best of times in terms of curriculum, potentially, if you had a good teacher, in terms of pedagogy, but they were also in some ways the worst of times, because there was no consistency really with the offer that students obtained. And the key questions that again I'll come back to today is this whole debate really about the relationship between the reliability of the way we assess and the validity of the way we assess. And I have shown the two polar opposites here, and maybe I might show them again as we go through. But I hope you understand what I mean. You know, that there are sort of like, we go in waves, certainly in this country, in terms of which of those things we value maybe more. And sometimes they're associated with the types of assessments we offer. So I'm going to make mention of these as I go through. So at that time, when we talk about sort of now assessment and educational systems in this country going back 30 years, there was a lot of trust in teachers at that time. But was there trust in exams? Well, nobody asked. They took it as read, really. Standards, there were lots of different tracks that people could take, which maybe has some similarities to now. There was a whole section of high profile qualifications at that time called Mode 3 qualifications, which I had was involved with for a few years when I first started teaching, which were teacher awarded, which actually teachers set the curriculum, they actually set the examinations, they marked the examinations, and they set the standards. And those were actually pretty well received. And but there was a notion of self-fulfilling prophecies. So people were sort of put into tram lines. So people sometimes at the age of 11 even, you know, it was pretty much predetermined where they were going to end up. And it became sort of almost self-fulfilling sometimes, how people actually, what they achieved and how they achieved it. Technology, one of my three issues. Well, not really, very much really. I mean, the only thing I can remember from that time is that there were OMR forms, sort of like to capture, actually, particularly in very high stakes exams, like A-level physics and chemistry, for example. There were multiple choice sections in there that were devilishly hard, partly because of sometimes the question types, the content, sometimes because the rubrics of the question types were so complicated that you spent a minute or two trying to work out exactly how you had to answer it. But anyway, that was, as far as I can remember, that was the only technology that was around. But then in the late 80s, then things changed, and that change had been coming for some time. And there was a huge reform period at that time. And again, that, as we know, that has been cyclical over the last 30 years. But at that time, it was quite a seismic change. And you know, a national curriculum was introduced. There was quite heavy control over what was taught and how it was taught, right the way from primary up to university entry. Teacher assessment was really, you know, seen as not a very good thing. That's the TGAP, Paul Black's work was sort of set out a model for how teachers should be involved in teacher sort of assessment for examinations. That was binned. So it became, and has ever become so until very, very recently, they really focused on the notion of external assessment, external target setting, and then all the things that come with it. You know, accountability, league tables, and then, you know, sort of like differing purposes of assessments. And then later on, the introduction of Ofsted, which is an inspection schedule that actually then monitors the quality of outcomes and teaching in schools. And so the relationship, I would say, at that time, at the end of the 80s. Now, again, this is a polar diagram. I take that as given, but I think it just makes the point that towards the end of the 80s into the 90s, and really pretty much ever since, the relationship changed in terms of the people were looking at, certainly sort of government and regulators, of which I worked with. The reliability was the key, and validity, certainly for very high stakes assessments, seemed to be not, in terms of the assessment experience and the mode of assessment, seemed to play second fiddle to the high reliability that we required, and everybody knows why that is. But the problem, of course, comes at that point, is that then the consequences of that is that the curriculum essentially became narrowed, and as we all sort of talk about and have sort of written about, no doubt, in educational sort of situations, we get this notion of construct underrepresentation, where you end up having to sort of deciding what you can easily measure and what can be reliably measured. But unfortunately, that sometimes puts the things that are really rich and valuable, puts them to the sides. And often then what happens is that people then just teach what they know is going to be assessed, don't teach the other things. And so, Dylan Williams' famous quote, we start out with the aim of making important measurable, and in the end, we only make the measurable important. And that is quite a well-trodden phrase in terms of what happens in high stakes assessment. Examples have come in, for example, in English language in this country at high school. Speaking used to be a component of the assessment because it wasn't reliable in terms of its assessment, and teachers were assessing it, and there was a feeling that they weren't being as consistent and reliable as they should have been. Then they took speaking assessment out of the construct. It wasn't assessed. The same has happened to some extent with practical skills in science and geography. But despite all of that, there's still sort of continues on year, this issue about whether standards are actually rising or falling. So you get, doesn't matter what happens, what the testing situation is, how reliable, how closed, how fixed forms are, you get this divide in terms of when you get to results season. There's accusations that really, students are not being stretched because the exams are too easy, that all the data has been manipulated. And then on the other hand, obviously saying, oh, well, standards have risen again, people are doing better. And you're never quite sure really, what the line is really in terms of the public perception of standards. And then obviously you've got the introduction of PISA over the last 20 years. And even though this country, it participates in PISA, it's not really dominated by PISA in the way that some countries are that don't have national testing systems. But certainly any country wants to be seen to be doing well in PISA as an international comparison. And the comparisons that PISA threw up certainly have played into educational reforms over the last 20 years in this country. Again, with the pendulum swinging from notions of very high content to being skills-based and everything in between. And again, we find ourselves always in this country having the debate about the gold standard. And these are just examples of the qualifications in this country. And my not very highly produced slide here shows this notion of a gold standard merging into something different as you go from left to right. And so the gold standard are seen to be like the A levels and the GCSEs, which of course are the ones that are all externally marked and that are pretty much pen and paper based. And so to revisit then those three themes that I mentioned at the beginning, the trust over the, since the sort of late 80s until fairly recently, there's been far less direct involvement by teachers, and in many ways teachers don't want it back because of workload issues. Far more concern about reliability. Standards, not straightforward, because sometimes it's not clear whether we're assessing the same standard over time, because as curriculum changes, then you know, the dynamic changes, and then people then say, well, you can't compare obviously a GCSE now with a GCSE 15 years ago because the content has changed, and that's true, and so have the assessments. But that notion of comparison is an ever-present you know, topic of conversation, and then, you know, the standards do seem to be linked to this maybe a more traditional view of assessment in terms of the conditions of assessment. But at the same time, we have considerably and significantly more access to higher education. Certainly in this country, you know, from way back when I was in that sort of phase, probably maybe 15–20% of people went to university. Now in this country, it's more like maybe 45 to 50%, especially if you count vocational degrees like nursing. And there are very different pathways actually into university. But still we have this notion of what we think is the gold standard. And also in terms of technology, not so much really. You know, as I'll mention in a minute, where technology was there, it was generally in the back end of the processes. And even actually things like those multiple choice papers that I talked about earlier that were evident actually in areas like physics and chemistry in the sort of 70s and 80s that were actually really demanding papers. There was we fell out of love with MCQs in this country. So even those sort of fairly simple styles of technology went out of favour. But now, okay, so now let's just revisit this notion of where we are in terms of technology. Okay, I go back to this always because I was there at QCA when Ken Boston said this. You know, I expect all on-screen assessments by 2009, and that e-assessment will be a routine provision. But actually, the subtitles are probably more interesting. Actually, he was sort of quite sort of clear that, you know, we needed to incorporate 21st century technology. There was a real need to modernise the logistics of examination management, and he coined this term cottage industry, because in this country it is really the whole system of high stakes assessments depends on volunteers really. I mean, they get paid for it, but they're generally teachers who on top of their day job mark scripts that are sent to them. Well, that used to be sent to them in the post. These days they get sent to them to their computers at home. And the notion between personalised learning and assessment on demand, and that was way back then. This was like, you know, 15 years ago, but it didn't happen. So why didn't it happen? Well, I mean, this is not a finite list, and you may have your own views about why we're still talking about it today, when in fact it could have quite easily been worked on at that time. Clearly, you know, the bones of a lot of the issue here is the lack of infrastructure in schools and the lack of hardware. And I'll come back in the end to, it wasn't so much an issue then because the assessments then were not delivered over the internet, but obviously now connectivity is the key. But also, we also have always got ourselves into this pickle about comparisons between paper-based and on-screen tests, particularly when we offer the same test in either a paper-based version or an on-screen version. More smart ways of doing this, as I'll talk about in a bit, are to try not to replicate those two versions, those two modes, and to try to do something a bit different and to then account for it in terms of the standard setting procedures. But we always get ourselves into a pickle here because paper-based is so ingrained into the notions, excuse me, of the gold standard. Governmental inertia, which I think you could put a /risk, which is understandable completely. Reliance on the status quo, that people know what they you know, they know the system, they know it, they've been used to it. And actually, you know, at that time, to be honest, over many years from that time, schools weren't too keen on e-assessments either. They were scared. They were scared of the risk of things breaking down, of the technology not working. So there's never been a very high consensus until fairly recently, for fairly obvious reasons. And actually, to be fair, at that time, in the early days, you couldn't do very sophisticated things with technology. You could do basic sort of item types and assessments, but you couldn't do the sort of things that we can do now. Okay, there was some intent. So these are two regulatory booklets that I had some dealings with years ago. The Regulatory Principles was published in 2007, and the consensus statement was like an agreement between all the awarding bodies on in what forms you could assume equivalence between paper-based and on-screen assessments. And that was, I think, that was signed up by awarding bodies in 2009. But I think to be, you know, it all sounds a bit sort of negative and depressing. But really what I would say is that since that maybe early stasis, actually, in the meantime, there are loads of pockets of innovative technologies, including the use of artificial intelligence, which I'll talk about, that are going on all around us. You know, transforming the manner in which learning takes place. You know, depending on what type of products we're talking about. Actually, how high stakes assessments can be delivered, again, which I'll talk about. And actually, I think one of the things that excites me the most about these technologies is that if they're done well, what they allow for is then like complete construct representation. So you can actually assess speaking, you can actually assess performance types to a very, very high level of reliability, and then actually keep the whole construct there, make our assessments authentic. So, you know, perhaps we can create assessment systems that we never imagined. And even though I talk about it being a long time ago, 20 plus years ago, in the general scheme of things, that's not that long if you think about how long paper-based assessments have been actually going on. So the technology, where it started was actually in the back end, as I mentioned, because that's the test taker didn't see this. And so, you know, Edexcel at that time, they were, I think, the first UK awarding body to actually have on-screen marking. So people took their tests on paper in schools. Those scripts were sent off to a central hub. All the separate pages were then scanned and still are into computers, which are then circulated around to markers all over the country. So there's no scripts dropping off the back of lorries. Markers can mark from home, and you can monitor things to a degree that is very difficult to do in a paper-based system. But I suppose the key point here is that the test taker never saw it. This was all background technology. Same with then, because all the marking became on screen, or, you know, marked on screen, what that again provides is huge amounts of data. And so what our awarding body and other awarding bodies have done since then is actually then use that data to actually be able to feed back to teachers and to schools, so that they can actually then carry out all sorts of interesting analyses on their performance, and actually individuals can as well on their own assessments. And in a paper-based versions, these were never possible. And then you get into the modes of learning, and you get sort of now these really clever sort of digital books that actually, you know, you have all your content, you have all your you have your normal formats of a book, but you also can embed into them all sorts of you know, digital learning aids, actually digital assessments, digital record books. But these things are, you know, they're fabulous to actually see. They sort and they try and mimic, I suppose, what a book looks like, even to the point of when you turn the page, it gives a page turning sound. But the amount of things that you can put into that book in terms of the digital aspects and formative work are fabulous. There are all sorts of, you know, innovative assessments going around. This is an example of some work that I did a long time ago, where we were looking at using animations of physiology, and then researching how we could then assess these things, but also use different types of answer mechanisms. So, for example, in these, they could actually answer. They could actually give open-ended answers. And we could then string match, as long as they were short, we could string match the answers to recognised mark schemes. So they were automated, but at that time, in a very sort of early form. These are examples of functional skills assessments, which I mentioned earlier in terms of when in this country, functional skills is a proficiency assessment that is taken by students in schools. It also can be taken by adults, and it gives them a proficiency level in English and mathematics. There are two modes for those assessments. You can take them on paper or you can take them on screen. And the different modes do not have the same number of marks. They do not have the same number of item types. Their design is a bit different. Their standards are linked, but the assessments themselves are not. And the reason for that is to, and again, this is going to be a theme, I think, of what I'm trying to talk about today, is that, you know, it's like when computers first came out, many years ago, people just didn't know what to do with them, and so they started writing notes to their milkman and writing their shopping lists on them. That's not the point of using computers in these type of environments. The point is to use their affordance. What can they do that you cannot do on a paper form? And so by making sure that we had the opportunity to design a different form of assessment, it allowed us then to use mechanisms onto sort of tools and question types that you couldn't do on paper, but you could do on screen. This is an example of, these are very old examples of functional skills English, where again, they were asked to contrast and compare two posters, and they could write open responses. Those responses were sent to online marking, so they weren't automatically marked, but you can see how then within the assessment, some of those assessment items could be marked straight away automatically. Some of those items had string recognition, so they could be marked pretty quickly with high reliability, and some of them went on to human markers because we didn't have the technology to mark ePen through ePen or an online marking. Okay, I'll just make mention of just to give you a notion of the scalability of some of the things I'm talking about. This is an example of some work that Pearson have been involved with for the last 2 years, where the Egyptian government wanted to create assessments for their high school every year, millions of students, both formative and summative, on laptops, on tablets, both in the interim years in a formative way, working up to a summative assessment at the end. This, and I wasn't involved with this, but it's been a Pearson-led product. This was an enormous enterprise, but it happened because the Egyptian educational ministry wanted it to happen and got buy-in by the government. Whole thing was funded, all students got laptops, and so they have these regular tests in a formative sense, using again a mixture of closed responses and open responses, which are then marked online, and they are getting now, from pretty much a standing start, a national profile of proficiency leading up to summative assessments. This work is still ongoing. Okay, and we're talking here about we're talking across the whole range of subjects, thousands of schools, now millions of students, millions of tests, actually over a fairly short period of time. Again, in this case, thousands and thousands of markers still involved in that process. So the idea that these systems can't work at scale and actually within restricted periods of time, I don't think that argument now holds. The example I'm going to talk about in terms of AI is an area that I am involved with these days, in terms of English language testing. And in some of our products that we produce, these are global assessments. They're used not just people here, they're used anywhere in the world. People can go to a testing centre, and in fact now they don't even need to go to a testing centre. They can actually be remote proctored on their laptops at home. And they can be assessed on those very skills that in paper-based assessments have the most issues with reliability, the performance type of assessments. So in this case, for example, this is an item where people They look at an image. They're given sort of 25, 30 seconds to have a look at an image, and then they actually describe what they're talking about. And their speech is actually captured on the computer, and then basically is then sent and is marked almost instantly. Okay, I'll come back to how that's done in a second. And again, the same goes for writing. They get 20 minutes to write a response, 300 words on a topic. This is part of obviously a high stakes study entry exam. And again, that's submitted. And actually, the technology that assesses this and marks it does it in seconds. Every single response will be different, just like every speaking response will be different. So to go back to what I was saying before, the problem with things like speaking and things like writing is that we know that there are issues of human reliability. You get the same responses, you get the left-hand one. Here's, let's say there's something extremely similar, and in this case, a spoken response. One rater might give it one sort of notion of a mark. Exactly the same response might get a different mark from somebody else. That is the nature of open-ended assessments. They've always been a challenge and obviously there are loads of balances, checks and balances in place that are standardization sort of. But I think, to go back to my the points I was making, I think in high stakes assessments, there has been a tendency to remove those awkward edges, to make the assessments in terms of high stakes fairly safe in terms of the things that you can ask and the things that you can assess, because the mark schemes have got to be pretty tight and pretty reliable in terms of their application. But in the AI systems, whatever, even though the the responses will be different, the genders in this case speaking will be different, the locations of where they take it, their accents will be different, because the engines have been trained. They will give, if it's worth the same mark, they will assign it exactly the same value. How do they work? In speaking and writing is pretty much the same. They are all individually trained. And I think one of the things that people get sort of, again, worried about when we talk about AI is they think that somehow that it's got nothing to do with humans and it's devoid of human judgment. Whereas in fact, these systems are built on human judgment. So all items are embedded into live tests. So people don't know where they're being pre-tested. Every single new response, new item is actually then trialed. And then we get a small group of expert raters to mark that as they would if it was a normal assessment. That then trains our systems. Okay, in a speaking sense, it captures all sorts of issues to do with their speech. We obviously have acoustic models on every language. So in this case, it's the English language, and just like, actually, for some reason, I don't know whether yours is the same, but for some reason, my computer is actually typing out my text at the bottom of the screen. These systems do the same thing, but they do it to a very, very high degree of reliability. And to validate that, then we put loads more responses in that it hasn't seen, and also get those human ratings checked, and check that the correlations are extremely high. For writing, it's similar. In this case, we use latent semantic analysis. So we don't look for surface level features. We're not looking for the number of words, or we're not looking for the things that you might think you could skim off the top. They actually are looking for the relationships of words with each other. And so we train the engines using the corpora that are around us, encyclopedias. You can imagine that Google is a handy place these days. So what happens is that it sort of turns words into vectors. And so you relate words to each other. And that means that even though somebody might describe something in completely different ways, which we all do when we write, what the systems do is that they relate those responses to each other in terms of their meaning. And so if the meaning was the same and it was written, using the right sort of indicators, which I'll talk about in a second, they would get exactly the same mark. Okay, so we with the systems are trained. They are trained by expert human markers, and then what they do then is that they then predict what that expert human marker would give, with samples taken every now and then to check that those reliabilities are the same. Okay, so just for example, in these two examples, in two of the areas where we've always had issues with reliability, technology provides now solutions, and these are done on a global scale, to assess all sorts of skills. And actually what happens is that some of these AI assessments, for example, in English language, some of them are used for high stakes summative assessments, and so some of those skills are maybe switched on and some of them are switched off. Some of these products are designed for formative, class-based, and so again that you can decide what products you want to focus on particular things. So some of them are to do with building bricks of literacy, and some of them are more summative in nature. And the key to all these, of course, is the reliability, because I'm sorry, but it's sort of for most assessment people, it does always find that word will find its way back into the conversation. And so what we look for in these machine scored assessments for speaking and writing is that the correlations between what the machine scores items and what human score it should be very, very close. And during the trialing of these things, if there are differences, then and mind you also, the human marking is all at least double marked, which again in paper-based assessment is just a dream, because if you could have double marking, so many of the issues that we talk about would not be there. But because we are training engines, we can double mark all items. And if there is a difference between the human marking and the machine scored, then the human wins, and we assume at that point that there's something the matter with the item and it goes back for revision. Okay, so these things are not no blue sky thinking. These things are not something we could do in the future. These are things that are happening now. Okay, to go back again to my three issues. And I would say, the point, I suppose it goes without saying really, that then 2020 happened and everything's changed and everything sort of like the status quo stopped, right? So, and we all know, that we've had issues in this country, and many other countries have had issues in their countries about, well, what to do with high stakes assessments for people at key transitional points. Even not transitional points, what do we do about school-based assessment when schools aren't open, when children have to be educated at home? What do we do? We know where we ended up last year, where we had to in the end sort of turn it back to teachers and sort of say, we're going to put our trust in you, and in this country in this year that exactly the same thing has happened. So we have loads of experience of so as I've shown, and I've only shown just a very small percentage of the spectrum of technology enhanced assessments, both formative and summative actually, that are happening here, that are happening globally. We all know that the international assessments now, like TIMSS and PISA and PIRLS, they're all on screen. They weren't 15 years ago, but they now have sort of, there's no, they are by default on screen assessments. Trust right now, the pendulum has swung back to teachers, but for how long? How long is that going to be the case for? What's going to happen in 2 or 3 years' time? In terms of standards, are we going to revert back to pre-COVID constructs and notions of comparable outcomes? And in terms of the curriculum, the assessed curriculum as we understood it, in the last sort of 15 years, maybe we should be really spending this time to imagine not just how we assess, in terms of clearly the discussions about whether we go back to a sort of a largely paper-based or a technology sort of based assessment, but really I would say we should start thinking about what we assess and potentially reset the standards clock. as I mentioned earlier, it's almost impossible to compare standards over time anyway. So why don't we maybe, use where we are now and the next few years planning forward of a new conceptualization really of the place of technology in high stakes assessments and assessments generally within schools. We have never needed technology more in terms of supporting learning, formative and summative assessments, clearly, as we all know, in and outside of the classroom. It's not just about the relationship now between a teacher and a student. It is, parents, students are sort of self-learning, and obviously, the government sort of wants everybody to do the right thing and the best thing. Everybody's involved in this. And so I would say, and again, I know I'm probably speaking to the converted for this special interest group. It's not why should we use technology? It's why on earth would we not use it? But like I said before, connectivity is the key infrastructure issue here, which is something that has been talked about a lot in this country over the year, because there is essentially an inequality of access to any sort of online provision if people don't have easy access to broadband. And also, if we're really going to reimagine what our assessments look like, then instead of leaving it to organisations to sort of, I suppose, be the only can carriers in terms of funding, this needs to be a collective in terms of where this country wants to go. So I think there is an opportunity to transform our notion of what assessment looks like from what we all know and have experience of on the left-hand side to a completely sort of flexible approach, really, to, yes, you can have very highly secure testing centres if you need them on a test when ready basis. You can have formative collaborative assessments going on inside classrooms, and you can have self-learning and even, assessments outside the classrooms. And as, again, many of you have been involved with, remote proctoring in terms of high stakes assessments on laptops in people's homes is now not a piece of blue sky thinking. These things are actually happening now. This is the aim, obviously, surely for us all, that we retain high reliability and use technology to support that, but we also give the best construct representation we can in terms of what it is we want to assess. And in my view, these are just some of the benefits. Obviously formative and summative, national, international, and we can apply these technologies across the board. We can use these technologies to go back to what Ken Boston was saying 15 years ago, to drive personalised learning and diagnostic feedback. We do need to modernise our cottage industry. It's not that it doesn't work, it works exceedingly well, but is it really what we want for the 21st century? The concept representation for me is a huge thing, as is actually workload, teacher workload. I've spoken to many teachers about the use of technology and AI over the last few years. And once discussed, teachers sort of are very keen with the idea that, if you want students to practice, let's say writing, in any subject, or let's say in English, writing essays or whatever, they can practice every night of the week if it's marked through AI, and then a teacher might sort of want to formally mark it themselves every couple of weeks. Fine, but practice is the key, and practice has always been the limiting factor in terms of access to teachers and the use of teacher time. And this notion of then creating a virtual combination, really, of what we can do best, which is, interacting with people and using information to guide individuals, and actually technology, which is just way more reliable than we are and does really boring things and doesn't moan about it and can get on with it and just provides what we need. Technology and AI and all these things should be creating and supporting a whole blended assessment tool for us. And as I said, it's not that it's not going on. I think there are fantastic pockets of these things going on. But right now, I don't see it in terms of high stakes assessments in this country. And if ever there was a time that maybe that discussion could be had, it probably is sort of now into the future. This is the article that Mary mentioned at the beginning of the session. I think it's been released today, I think. And this article goes into a lot more detail about some of the issues that I've spoken about today. I think what I spoke today about is not this journal article, but I think many of the issues, and actually if you're interested in what goes on inside, let's say, artificial intelligence systems, there's a bit more detail in that journal article. Okay, so thank you very much. I hope I haven't overrun. I think that gives us time now, hopefully, Mary, to either hear some comments or to take some questions.
Thank you, Rose. That's fantastic. Yeah, we do indeed. We have about 15 minutes at this point for some questions. So please do type in the chat, or if you're feeling very excitable and brave, you might want to raise a hand and ask something live to the front. I'm going to take the chairs on here and just say a couple of things. Say, here, it was fantastic to think about this idea of using AI in a way to get rid of marking, because I tell you what, there's nothing. I'm trying to think of the collective noun. It's like a moan of markers, really, when essays come piling in, etc. And I hear it in HE, I've heard it in school, I've heard it everywhere. So none of us like that. If we can take some of that pain out of the process of assessment, there's lots of exciting stuff we can be doing. I think one of the big questions, and this is certainly an overarching question for me, and it comes up time and again in terms of planning and talking to policymakers, and I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this, Rose, or anyone else might have, is just the time it takes, what a realistic time frame is for enacting change. Because of course I always think that, policymakers often say, yeah, let's change something and we'll do it new next month. And of course, one thing we all know in education is you need time to enact things because of how they work. But I think the interesting thing is we've had a long time in the background, lots of us working on all sorts of online assessments. So I wonder what you think the kind of realistic appetite is for that, and whether you think it's something we might just default back to what we were.
Yeah, I think that's the problem, isn't it? That's the problem. I mean, again, I'm sure people will want to jump in now, but again, when I do some of these talks on paper assessments and paper assessments go back to Chinese civil service exams 2,000 years ago. So any time period that we're talking about now in terms of enacting change is nothing compared to looking back over 2,000 years in terms of a status quo. And I think, the other thing I would say is that, we are already, where I work, we are already planning for the future in terms of where technology will take us in 5 years' time. So, and the other thing I would say is that, as we know, sort of educational sort of specifications work in cycles, and we're actually coming to the point where we actually are having to think about what our next cycle of GCSEs and A-levels will look like. Maybe if we started to seriously talk about this now, when those new specifications come online, which will be in probably maybe 2 or 3 years' time, why would that not be feasible? I think we should be ambitiously cautious. I could say a year's time, but probably the more fundamental connectivity, the infrastructures, all those things, and curriculum change always takes time. But you'd think, wouldn't you, that within 3 to 5 years, why couldn't we imagine now that things would be very much linked to actually the way that technology is all around our students, the way that they're experiencing their life these days, the way that they're learning? You'd think that maybe now is the time for us to grasp that nettle and make sure that in 3 or 5 years' time, that what we're assessing is not only reflecting in terms of how they can access these assessments in terms of the technologies, but also the types of things we're assessing.
Well, we shall see. Now, there's a couple of questions. Thanks for that in the chat. So first, we've got thanks from Jeff Chapman here. A JISC study has showed up to 13% of learners are locked out by paper exam delivery. So why do stakeholders shy away from advocating the accessibility and compliance benefits of tech-enabled delivery?
Yeah, okay. I mean, the thing is that, you know, again, I mean, I was involved in national curriculum testing many years ago, and there's always exceptions to the rule, you know. And I think it is one of the things I try and avoid is this polar argument that it's all or nothing. You know, that you can imagine, you know, the warning bells that would be sounded by saying, okay, right, but in 3 years' time, everything's going to be on screen, everything's going to be online. There's going to be people that. There's going to be those that's not the best solution or option for them. Fine, all these things can be accommodated, you know. But at the moment, the window for on-screen technology-enabled assessment in a high-stakes environment in this country is zero.
Okay, thanks. Tom Anderson, thanks, Tom. This is a great question, and I'm intrigued. I've actually just been thinking about this very issue this week. On the subject of trust, is that the right way of putting it? I don't expect people to trust me. I'm quoting Tom, by the way, especially unconditionally, but I try to act in a trustworthy way and hope other people's trust or perhaps confidence follows on from how I behave. Shouldn't teachers expect the same when it comes to their role in assessment? That's quite an interesting philosophical question, actually, about the use of the word trust.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, those of us that are involved in research, okay, you can stand up and you can say anything, right, that, you know, you may believe. And, you know, I can stand up and say, well, I've been working in this industry for 35 years. I'm telling you this, trust me, right? And the first question that I would expect anybody to say is, show me your evidence. Right, and that's I would imagine it's as simple as that. So trust in teachers is predicated by you know, teachers being open to showing evidence of what their judgments are, which is, I think, nobody has an issue with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the technology needs to do the same thing. So, you know, in a paper-based assessment system or a technology-based assessment system, the proof of it is show the evidence of the trustworthiness of those systems. Just like if you as a teacher have to show me your judgment, I want to see the evidence in which you base it. And the point about, I think the tipping point really, to go back to what I was saying about reliability, is that in general, good or bad, people differ in terms of their perceptions of standards. You can keep as tight a line as you can, but there's always going to be some difference in there. The more, if there are really high stakes decisions based on it, the more we can take those edges out and actually create systems where there is no grey area, where we trust the reliability of their systems because they're hardwired. Why wouldn't we want to use them?
Good point. Well, thank you. Dan asks, given the issues that arose last year around grade adjustments for some learners, i.e. disadvantaging learners from so-called underperforming centres, do you think there is a role for AI in some way to safeguard against this moving forward, whether we use centre-assessed grades or older models of adjusting grade boundaries?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, but I think what I would want to do is keep those two things completely separate. You know, what I'm talking about is the use of AI to reduce bias on an assessment. So whoever takes an assessment, wherever they are from, whoever they personally are, they will be assessed in exactly the same way, and you get that consistent standard. The use of you know, as soon as you start talking about AI algorithms and the way that, because actually there were no AI algorithms used for the grade adjustments last year. They were you know, sort of statistical models. That is a completely different line of argument. I'll talk about the assessment side of it.
Thanks. Ingrid asks, how far is the development of automatic scoring of mathematical expressions come along?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually. I have some dealings with that in the company that I work with. There, I can't remember now the name of it. There's we have produced a. It's only used formatively. But we produce a, again, it was part of a research project really, to produce a program that enabled, it was a calculus program, it is a calculus program, where you could actually write your answer down in hand, by freehand, because obviously if you think about maths in terms of the way that you want to express your answers, sometimes keyboards and things like that, styluses are pretty good actually, but in this case, you could actually just use pen and paper, and actually then that can be scanned in and actually be an AI formative program would actually assess your strengths and weaknesses. So I think it's more aspirational than where English is right now, but it's because maths is such a central subject. There's a lot of work going on in that area.
Okay, thanks. And we've got time for one more, possibly two. Jack asks, could you suggest the best way into reading more about e-assessment in high stakes assessment? Is there a seminal text that's a good starting point for self-education? Of course, you can read that smashing paper, Jack, that's quoted earlier in the chat, that's open access. But what would your go-to text be? There are lots of e-assessment experts here today, actually, in this participants list. So if people want to throw ideas of reading into the list for Jack, that would be lovely. But I don't know what your choice would be, Rose.
Oh, sorry, was the question about AI or e-assessments in general?
Sorry, about e-assessment. So to sort of get your basic ear into reading it, and then obviously you could diversify.
Yeah, I'm not sure really. I think I would, as a very good introduction, I think the paper that we've just produced, which was written partly with this in mind in a way, is to at least sort of lay some issues down on the table, because it's got plenty of references in it. It's probably not a bad start, but actually, I mean, because this SIG group again probably has contributors who have done lots of work like this in the past. Maybe your SIG contributors might be able to help there.
Definitely. There's the, I would say, Jack, to have a look at the website for the E-Assessment Association. That's excellent in terms of, you know, people and, you know, presentations and other links going forward. And then if you haven't already had a chance to have a look at, say, the, you know, the kind of best assessment journal, which is Assessment in Education. And they have obviously special editions at different times that look at e-assessment and that have been looking at new sort of new thinking about assessment.
Yeah, I'd say the thing is though that I suppose, as I maybe have mentioned once or twice today, these conversations have been going on for the last 25 years. And so sometimes you look back, a lot of the literature, let's say, would be going back to maybe sort of like 2000. Whereas, and the trouble in this area, obviously, is that things get dated quite quickly. So the things that were talked about a lot in the literature at that time are, you know, things have changed enormously in a relatively short amount of time.
Yeah, I think definitely you're right there. Matt Wingfield's put up, of course, thank you, Matt, putting up a link there for the e-assessment association, because that's a great start. But I think just to sort of tie it up there, that's what Rose said there is really important. There's a lot of the underlying arguments that are the same in our understanding of e-assessment and things to do with e-assessment, but then it's the technology and the actual approach and process and practice around it then that sometimes moves at quite alarming speed too.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Rose. That's fantastic. We're on 2 o'clock and I know quite a lot of people, this is their kind of their virtual lunch break. So I would just like to say thank you on behalf of AEA Europe and the E-Assessment SIG for your contribution today. It's been fantastic. We've had lots of really good feedback there in the chat from people saying how you know, how interesting it's been, how informative it's been. And so thank you all for coming too. We had lots of interest, of course, for this presentation, as I thought we might. There will be another e-assessment SIG presentation coming right up very soon, and details will be coming out through that. Please do look at the new updated AEA Europe website too, because we have SIG pages there. And we're going to be promoting information. If you'd like to join the e-assessment SIG, it just takes one click and enter your email.
Yeah.
As I said, I'll send out all the details afterwards again to all of you who've registered, so you can watch again if you wish. But in the meantime, I hope you all stay well. Thank you very much for being involved, and thank you, Rose.
No, and see you virtually in Dublin maybe later.
Okay, we will see you all again very soon. Thank you all, and take care.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.